Sanctions have been one of the most important tools the collective West has used to hurt Russia as it wages war against Ukraine. Since Vladimir Putin's February 2022 invasion, 21,692 sanctions have been levied on Russia. But Russia has found its way around many of them, especially sanctions related to its oil and gas sales. With its ever-growing shadow fleet of unregistered and illegal ships, Russia has continued to sell resources and generate revenue to fund Putin's war. Now, that may be all over. Ukraine has cottoned on to the dangers of the shadow fleet and is launching precision strikes that are devastating Russia's illicit ships. That's according to Chuck Ferrum, who wrote an analysis of what Ukraine has pulled off for the Kyiv Post on July 5. He says that Ukraine hasn't gone public about its shadow fleet operation. It can't. Its attacks against Russia's illegal ships often take place outside its or Russia's waters. But those attacks are still happening in covert operations that are devastating Russia. As Ferrum puts it, Ukraine's operation has taken aim at the heart of Russia's illicit shadow fleet of oil tankers. Operating under flags of convenience to dodge Western sanctions, these ships are Moscow's lifeline, ferrying oil to fund its war machine, and Ukraine is striking them worldwide. The attacks span Europe. Ukraine has hit Russia's shadow fleet ships in the Black Sea, Baltic Sea, and the Mediterranean, with only the first of those three being part of the active war between Russia and Ukraine. Sabotage has become Ukraine's stock in trade. Unmanned vehicles are its tools for taking out massive Russian tankers. Every single assault against Russia's shadow fleet represents a masterclass in Ukrainian subterfuge and ingenuity, all designed to hit Putin where it hurts. Right in the pocketbook he's using to fund his Ukraine invasion. And there are more of these attacks happening against the shadow fleet than many realise. Ferrum rattles off 5, starting with a tanker named Seacharm. Sailing under the flag of the Marshall Islands on January 28, that tanker was making its way around Turkey's Black Sea coast. That's when it was hit. Though Ukraine hasn't confirmed its role in the strike, it's believed that it was a Ukrainian naval drone that delivered a massive and explosive payload that tore a 3-foot breach in the Seacharm's hull. Ferrum explains. The tanker's propulsion system was crippled, and the Seacharm was dead in the water. And just like that, Ukraine sent a message to Putin. The loss of a single tanker isn't a huge blow to Russia. It can absorb that sort of loss. Far more worrying for Putin is that the shadow fleet sails on discreet and supposedly secret routes to avoid Western sanctions. Ukraine hitting the Seacharm showed Putin that it has eyes on the routes Russia is using, and as importantly, it's willing to project its power far beyond the battle lines of the Ukraine war to stop Russia from using its shadow fleet. And the January 28 attack was just the beginning. On February 4, Ukraine struck again. This time, its target was a ship named the Ferrum. Sailing under the Liberian flag, the vessel had arrived at Tobruk in Libya, which Ferrum says is a hub for Russia's sanctions-dodging oil trade. It's believed Ukraine used a drone again, as a powerful explosion ripped through the ship from the inside, taking out its propulsion shaft and causing enormous damage that forced the ship's owners to spend heavily on a salvage operation. In its report on the incident, the new Voice of Ukraine revealed that the ship's salvage tracking data showed that it had recently visited a Russian port. Ukraine knew precisely what it was doing, both in terms of choosing its target and how it scuttled the ship. The Ferrum didn't sink. That was never Ukraine's intention. As with the Seacharm, Ukraine hit the ship's propulsion system to leave it dead in the water. That was another message delivered to Putin. Ukraine wasn't about to get sloppy with its shadow fleet strikes. Each one would be precise, well planned, carried out in such an expert way that the blame could never be directed at Ukraine, and even if it was, Putin wouldn't have a case, because he knows that accusing Ukraine would amount to revealing his illicit use of the ships Ukraine struck to skirt sanctions. Ukraine had Putin stuck between a rock and a hard place, and they knew it. Seemingly growing in confidence, Ukraine struck again on February 15. This time it was the Seagull, a ship sailing under Malta's flag that was moored in the Italian port of Savona Vado. United 24 media reported on the incident at the time, noting that a pair of explosions rocked the ship while it was docked and preparing to unload its cargo. Again, Ukraine had chosen its target carefully. Though the Seacharm sailed under the Maltese flag, United 24 says it was on a list of illicit vessels Russia was using to transport oil to European Union or EU nations. The ship had transported Russian cargo at least 3 times during 2024, in February, March and May. The same outlet reveals that the ship's crew reported hearing 2 loud bangs, with a later investigation revealing that concave deformations on the vessel's hull suggested the use of explosive devices. The outcome was the same as the first 2 attacks. The Seacharm was rendered inoperable without being sunk. Ukraine had pulled off another masterclass in subterfuge that Ferrum says would have involved the combined use of real-time tracking and covert assets to scuttle the ship. After all, the explosions didn't come out of nowhere. Ukraine would have needed to sneak an operative onto the ship to plant the bombs in locations where the rest of the crew would never think to look. That gave Putin even more to think about. Now, Ukraine was targeting his shadow fleet vessels in farther-flung European waters. Plus, Russia clearly had an issue with covert operatives working on its territory to handle. If not in Russia, those operatives might have been working in Italy and had found their way onto a ship that was supposed to be well guarded. Either way, that's a problem for Putin. Yet so many of Putin's questions about how Ukraine is pulling all of this off remain unanswered. And if Ukraine has its way, that's how it'll stay. And there's more. While Putin was worrying about Ukrainian attacks against his shadow fleet in Europe, Ukraine's covert operatives were cooking up something much closer to home. Later in February, Ukraine hit the Koala, a ship sailing under the flag of Antigua and Barbuda. This time, Ukraine's strike took place at Russia's Ust-Luga port, which is located in the Baltic Sea. The attack was an escalation. The story for the Koala was the same as that for the other 3 ships in terms of damage. A blast took out its propulsion system and decimated its engines. The ship was dead in the water, but like the other Ukrainian targets, wasn't sunk. But this time, Ukraine launched an attack in Russia's waters. It hit deep, with the message this time being that Ukraine has operatives who can strike against Russia inside Russia at any time. Ust-Luga was also a clear target. Ferrum explains in his Kyiv Post article, because it's a vital Russian oil export node. That means it's well defended. Ukraine circumvented those defenses, likely using a combination of drones and special forces operatives to take out yet another shady Russian ship. After that, everything went quiet for a few months. By March, Ukraine was embroiled in a roller coaster with the US that saw the Trump administration first cut off US military aid and intelligence sharing, and then restore both as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signaled his willingness to engage in the 30-day ceasefire. The next few months involved a lot of wrangling between Zelensky, Putin, and US President Donald Trump to try and get that ceasefire off the ground. The ceasefire never came. Putin has said no time and time again. But during all of that time, it seems that Ukraine held off on Shadow Fleet strikes in the hope that a ceasefire would be struck. By the summer of 2025, amidst Putin launching a renewed offensive in Ukraine, all of that hope was gone. Ukraine decided to restart its Shadow Fleet campaign, and that leads to June 29 and the most recent of Ukraine's Shadow Fleet strikes. On the coast of Benghazi in Libya, the Vilamoura was struck. Sailing under the Maltese flag, the ship got caught up in a powerful blast. The modus operandi showed exactly who was responsible. The ship's propulsion shaft and steering system were destroyed, leaving it still floating but practically useless. Again, Ukraine had showcased to Putin that it knows the routes and ports his shadow ships use to transport their cargo. Ruthless and efficient, Ukraine decimated yet another ship that is key to Putin's oil trade. This quintet of strikes makes clear that Ukraine has been cooking up something interesting for months. Starting in early 2025, Ukraine must have been injecting covert operatives into Russia and other countries, in addition to acting on intelligence provided by those operatives and potentially other sources. As soon as it identified one of Putin's Shadow Fleet ships, Ukraine went into planning mode. Propulsion systems were identified. The means for striking those systems were created. Then, when it was ready, Ukraine hit Putin's ships so hard that they became practically worthless unless Russia was willing to invest heavily to salvage the battered vessels. Putin has no recourse. He can't complain about what's happening to these ships because doing so would amount to admitting the existence of his shadow fleet. Ukraine has found a far more effective method for stopping the shadow fleet than Europe or the US. Neither has directly attacked any of Russia's shady ships for fear of escalating with Putin. Ukraine has no such concerns. It sees that the West's sanctions can only work if the shadow fleet is destroyed. Back in May, during the gap between Ukraine's initial spate of strikes and its attack in June, the European Union formally adopted a new round of sanctions against Russia that included the blacklisting of 189 vessels, reports Euronews. That brought the total number of ships sailing under restrictions up to around 350. Perhaps an interesting sort of interplay is happening here. Europe announces its sanctions, knowing that Putin is likely to skirt them. Ukraine becomes aware of the ships that have been sanctioned and starts gathering intelligence. It figures out which ships represents the best targets and strikes. All the while, the EU can claim it has nothing to do with any of this, like legitimately, because it's not doing anything wrong by announcing the specific ships it's sanctioning. Again, Putin can do nothing about any of this. Of course, this is all conjecture. Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility for any of the strikes against Russia's shadow fleet, though it seems pretty clear that it's behind all of them. What's really important here is why these attacks matter. Understanding that requires a dive into what Russia's shadow fleet is and what it provides to Putin as he continues his invasion of Ukraine. The Geopolitical Monitor delivers a solid summary. It says that Putin started building his shadow fleet in the wake of the raft of sanctions the West announced against Russia following his invasion of Ukraine. That fleet is a network of clandestine ships, typically sailing under the flags of other countries, that use a host of deceptive practices to avoid international monitoring and detection. These practices range from using irregular routes to actively hiding their presence in the world's oceans via spoofing and other techniques. Russia has spent big on developing this fleet. Geopolitical Monitor notes that the Kyiv School of Economics believes Russia has spent about $10 billion to expand its shadow fleet since 2022, which numbered somewhere in the region of 400 vessels by March 2025. Those ships are responsible for shipping Russian oil to ports all over the world, allowing Putin to avoid the oil price caps and other sanctions the West has levied against his country. In June 2024, Russia was shipping 4.1 million barrels of oil per day using its shadow fleet, with the fleet accounting for 70% of the country's seaborne oil trade and 89% of its total crude oil exports. Growth has been a constant for the shadow fleet since the start of the Ukraine war. In February, the International Bar Association called the fleet a growing threat, while highlighting how Russia has been using it to continuously increase its shipments of oil products and crude oil. In April 2022, when the shadow fleet first started to emerge, Russia was using it to ship 719,000 barrels of crude daily, along with 455,000 barrels of oil products. Fast forward a year, and the numbers had grown to 1.849 million barrels of crude and 852,000 barrels of oil products. By April 2025, crude shipments were at 3.077 million barrels per day, with 929,000 barrels of oil products. And the growth keeps on coming. On July 3rd, Pravda reported that the shadow fleet has tripled in size since 2022, and that's a conservative estimate. What started as a collection of fewer than 100 ships now numbers anywhere between 300 and 600, with 40% of the vessels having been purchased from sellers in the EU. Most of the ships are aging to the point that they're reaching the end of their traditional lifespans. Pravda even points out that the typical shadow tanker is between 20 and 25 years old, which is much older than the average of 13 years for a standard oil tanker. Putin doesn't care. As long as they can sail and hold cargo, he's willing to buy and use them. There's a simple reason why this growth of the shadow fleet is such a massive problem for Ukraine. It keeps money flowing into Russia. A lot has been made of Russia's recent economic woes, and rightly so. The country is burning through its national reserves and is on the brink of economic collapse. You can find out more about that in our video covering Russia's dire economic situation. However, the reality is that all of these problems would have arrived much quicker for Russia were it not for the shadow fleet. Statista reveals this in a chart that covers the amount of revenue Russia has received from its fossil fuel exports between February 24, 2022 and June 7, 2025. Even with Western sanctions in effect, Russia has managed to generate a staggering $610.34 billion in oil revenue in just over 3 years. It's also earning billions of dollars from gas and coal. The former accounts for $186.6 billion entering Russia's collective coffers during Statista's time period, whereas coal has earned Russia $93.22 billion. Not all of this money goes directly into Putin's war chest, but a huge amount of it does, and much of it is money that Russia should never have been able to access. Bear in mind that, according to Ukraine, Putin's war is costing him up to $1 billion per day. Assuming that figure is accurate, Russia's total expenditure on the war has already exceeded the $1 trillion mark. Having nearly that amount of money coming in during the war thanks to illicit oil, gas and coal sales has been a huge help to Putin at a time when his country is struggling to produce or sell anything else other than its fossil fuels. So it's obvious why Ukraine's shadow fleet strikes matter. Each ship Ukraine scuttles is a ship that can't transport the products Russia is selling. Less money for Putin amounts to reduced pressure on the front lines. Russia can't create as much equipment, it can't pay for as many soldiers. And while 5 ships may seem like a small dent in the grand scheme of things, Ukraine knows that every successful attack strikes fear into Putin's heart. Perhaps it will do the same for the people crewing Russia's shady ships. How much longer will the promise of being able to profit from Putin's illicit dealings appeal to those crews if Ukraine continues bombing the ships they're sailing? Only time will tell. Now, another reason why Ukraine's shadow fleet strikes matter is that they highlight just how effective the country's asymmetric warfare techniques have become. That's precisely what the shadow fleet strikes are, an asymmetric strategy that doesn't fit into the traditional battle Putin is trying to wage on Ukraine's territory. These sorts of techniques have become commonplace for Ukraine. Trends Research and Advisory said as much in May 2024, as it noted that Ukraine, as the smaller of the two nations involved in the conflict, has disparate military capabilities and strategies than Russia. To make up for those gaps, Ukraine has engaged in everything from guerrilla warfare on its own territory to cyber attacks and operations that see it hit Russia where it hurts. Ukraine's use of drones is the perfect example. By focusing on the mass production of unmanned vehicles, Ukraine has been able to level the playing field in the face of Russia's vast manpower and resources advantages. It's also used its drones to pull off strikes unlike anything Putin could have expected. Take Operation Spiderweb as an example. In early June, Ukraine managed to pull off an attack that saw it sneak over 100 of its first-person view drones into Russia. Those drones struck 4 Russian airfields, taking out several of Russia's nuclear-capable bombers in an attack that mirrors what's being seen with Ukraine's shadow fleet strikes in terms of their covert nature and their use of Ukraine's special forces operatives. On June 13, the National Security Journal added to this, noting that Ukraine has created a full-scale guerrilla warfare campaign against Russia using operatives who are working in Russian territory. Sabotage, strikes against Russia's logistics and infrastructure, the disruption of Russia's military advances, and now with the shadow fleet strikes, attacks against Russia's revenue sources all fall under this strategy. Ukraine has been able to adapt its asymmetrical tactics to the flow of Putin's war. When Russia attacked with tanks, Ukraine responded with drones. When Putin ordered the creation of a massive military-industrial complex in his country to boost wartime production, Ukraine responded by attacking manufacturing facilities on Russia's territory. When Putin spent over $14 billion to build a rickety fleet of oil tankers to circumvent Western sanctions, Ukraine responded again. It started scuttling those tankers, and the odds are high that it's going to keep doing it. That'll worry Putin even more. He knows that he can't do anything about Ukraine's asymmetric warfare tactics. The country's operatives are too good, and Russia has spent over 3 years trying and failing to catch them in their various acts. Now, Putin has to face up to the fact that Ukraine is expanding its scope. That's what's evident with these shadow fleet attacks. Libya, Italy and Turkey have all become targets in their own ways. Of course, Ukraine isn't directly hitting any of those countries, but it's taking out Putin's ships as they sail near or dock in those nations. Ukraine has somehow managed to make its asymmetric strategy go global, which is yet another thing that Putin couldn't have expected. The Shadow Fleet is far from destroyed, but every strike Ukraine conducts amounts to the loss of cargo and the forced investment into more ships on Russia's part. If Ukraine can keep this up, it'll cause massive damage to Russia's revenue streams at a time when Putin's decisions have left its economy on the verge of crumbling. Now, Ukraine has redefined warfare in its battle against Putin's expansionism. Nowhere is that clearer than in the many drone innovations that have allowed Ukraine to get as far as it has. Find out more about those innovations and why they've enabled Ukraine to do things like take out Shadow Fleet ships in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the Military Show for more commentary on the latest Ukrainian tactics and how they're hurting Russia.